This week's topic is constructing the Nemeton. And Nemeton, I think for a lot of people, is an unfamiliar word, although maybe not for people who are familiar with Celtic paganism or Druidism or Druidry. But I should define that term before I do anything else, because it is a Celtic-specific word. Nemeton can be understood as a sanctuary. It's often translated with that word. Or more generally, a sacred place, or maybe even a better word to use would be a holy place. I'm not a linguist, but I believe that the root of Nemeton, the Old Celtic root, is related to the Irish word neve, which we find in words like Neve Padraig, St. Patrick. And I've been given to understand in the past, although I don't know if this is really true, that there is a connotation of the celestial or the heavenly in that word, at least in its Irish incarnation. And there is a relationship between Nemeton as sacred place and the equivalent Greek word temenos, which also refers to a sacred precinct or sacred place. So, in essence, what I'm going to talk about is some concepts related to the constructing of a place to do religious work, to do sacred work, sacred precinct, if you will. And I'm going to try to talk in terms that are applicable both to personal space, private, personal ritual space, and also more generally to group ritual space, both temporary, ad hoc worship space, ritual space, and more developed, more permanent approaches. So first of all, I want to look at just generally some ideas drawn from specifically Celtic tradition about what constitutes a sacred place. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the kinds of places that have been regarded as sacred and been used for a ritual purpose in traditional Celtic cultures. I'm going to talk a little bit about what might mark such a place as being important for that kind of use. And then I'm going to segue into talking a little bit about how one might make such a place sacred, or perhaps at least more sacred. So in talking about this, I'm going to harken back to something I touched on in the first session of this course on Will and Word, which was a concept of power approached using a couple of Irish terms, brie and bua. And I want to, again, as I did in the previous talk, acknowledge the contemporary pagan author and teacher Ian Corrigan for helping to elaborate on and advance this notion, at least for modern usage. The distinction is between brie, which is inherent, indwelling power or efficacy in a thing or a person, and bua, which is power that can be increased, that can be added to something, so that something has, or a person has, or an entity has, an inherent quantity of influence or power, which we can refer to as brie. You could even loosely think of that in terms of, say, the charisma that a person has, and which is a quality that's often hard to define. It just seems to be there sometimes in certain people. And bua as being energy, power, influence that's increased, that can be added to that indwelling, inherent store of power. So thinking about places, let's say in the natural environment for starters, that get identified, get marked out, get treated as sacred, as appropriate places, either for the holding of religious ritual in themselves without any sort of elaboration or further construction, or as sites on which you might build or add a temple or an altar, etc., etc. Places can have that same sort of magnetism or charisma, if you will, that people can. Sedona in Arizona, for example, widely known and is quite the tourist attraction because it has supposed vortices. It has places that are vortexes of power that supposedly concentrate earth energy or some other spiritual current, and that people are sensitive to. One could consider this to be a manifestation of Bree, that these are places that, however one is sensitive to them, however they present this to individuals or groups of people, they have a great store of Bree. They have a great deal of inherent influence or power. Certain kinds of places, mountain peaks, for example, seem to exert this kind of magnetism on people in general, whether it's due to just their aesthetic characteristic, their majesty, their impressiveness, their size, or whatever. But there are certain places, certain features in the natural environment that attract people, that mark themselves out as sacred. And among certain kinds of places, like mountain ranges, mountain peaks, certain hills, certain mountain peaks, seem to be more impressive, more magnetic, more charismatic, more important, perhaps more sacred than others. And again, you could just consider this loosely as places that, for whatever reason, exert excessive influence, extra influence compared to other similar places, and therefore we could, as shorthand, call them carriers of a high degree of Bree, of inherent power. Well, what sorts of places were actually used, first of all, in the natural environment for the purposes of ritual in the Druidic times among the ancient Celts? There are references in the classical writers to the groves used or frequented by the Druids for their rituals. Some of the descriptions from the classical writers are quite lurid and describe these dark, spooky places in the midst of the woods with blood-drenched, gore-dripping altars. It's generally understood that there's a certain amount of negative propaganda attached to these particular accounts, that these were Romans who were attempting to demonize, to one degree or another, the religion of Celts, who were in an adversarial relationship to the Romans. But there probably is some sort of germ of truth, at least, that there probably was some use of wooded places, of groves and forests, for at least some kind of religious work by the Druids. The fact that Pliny talks in a completely different context about the harvesting of mistletoe from a tree by the Druids at least suggests these sort of multiple references to trees and the Druids suggest that there must have been some kind of relationship. Otherwise, as a caricature, if that's what was going on, it wouldn't have meant anything. It wouldn't have had any resonance with the people who would have been encountering the caricature. So we kind of have to sort through propaganda, ancient propaganda, versus what the reality might have been in terms of actual sacred sites, and then also come to terms with our own idealization as moderns of the natural environment, of trees in particular, of forests in general, that we as moderns, and particularly as modern pagans, practicing what we so often describe as earth-centered spirituality, want this in some way to be true. We want the Druids of old to have been practicing their religion in the natural environment, in the midst of forests, in this sort of unspoiled place, because it harmonizes with what we want to be practicing as modern pagans, what we would like to be an element of our own spirituality. Well, there's no reason not to indulge that idealization a bit. There's no reason not to play with, as a modern pagan, the idea of worshiping out of doors, perhaps in the forest, maybe not, maybe just in an open park setting. But I think it's helpful to understand that some of this is modern projection, modern idealization, not necessarily what the ancients were doing. I'm going to come back to this, but it's suffice it to say at this point that we do know for a fact that the ancient Celts, the pre-Roman Celts in, say, Britain, did have temple structures. And this is true in Ireland as well. So the ancient Druids weren't just worshiping in sacred groves in the midst of trees. So what kind of places were they used? Well, I'm going to come back to sort of temple architecture in a few minutes. But there are definitely features in the natural environment that were used that can be literally replicated in the modern world or emulated symbolically. So let's talk briefly about those. The first is wells or springs or shafts into the ground. These are places where the world in which we humans live, the world above ground, intersects with and penetrates into the lower world, the underground, subterranean realm, or where things like fresh water come up from the underground realms and enter into our world. I'm going to talk about boundaries and more generally the quality of liminality, quality of boundaries, in just a bit here. But this is the first place that concept rears its head, and that is in the notion that, as I say, one realm penetrates another at a place like a well or a spring. And these are usually good markers of potentially useful sacred places, sites for worship. People might emulate a well or a spring with the use of a cauldron. They might actually dig a shaft into which to place offerings, because this is what we find in the archaeological record: the use of wells, of springs, of lake shores, of sort of piers that have been built out onto a lake to deposit ritual offerings. These offerings are also often made into shafts, wells, if you will, without water. Sometimes over a period of many generations, find layer upon layer upon layer of ritual offerings in shafts that eventually get covered over. So that's one sort of sacred place. We find evidence, as I say, in archaeology from Celtic times of the use of these entrances into the underworld, if you will, as places to do religious work, in particular to make offerings. If, no pun intended, if a well or a shaft or a spring is an entrance from our world into the underworld, another place we can look for a possible sacred site would be where our world tries to penetrate into the upper world, the sky, into the celestial realm. That would be hilltops, mountaintops for starters, and another sort of object that penetrates the sky, which would be trees. And we find evidence of both of those as being sacred places. Celtic lore is full of, both mythological and folklore, records are full of references to sacred hilltops. And these survive down into and become actually important in Christian practice. There are penitential climbs to mountaintops that are dedicated to St. Patrick in Ireland, for example. And the assumption is that the importance of these hilltops goes back into pre-Christian times, and that they were probably dedicated to the pre-Christian gods and goddesses as well. I'm going to come back to the importance of the hilltop fire later on in this talk, but that is one of the major markers of the importance of hills in the ancient Celtic lore, is that we do have tales of, and not just from pagan records, but from Christian records, sacred fires being lit on important hilltops. And this isn't just something we find in Ireland. We find important mountains like, say, Mount Snowdon in the Welsh tradition as well. Trees. Not only do they sort of penetrate upward, they also all extend their roots down into the underworld. And they have a quality that can be very important in marking out a place for sacred use. And that is that they are a central pillar. They're a axis mundi, if you will, a world axis. And the writer Mircea Eliade, among others, pointed out the importance of that around the world, not just in Celtic tradition, not just in Indo-European tradition, but around the world. In many cultures, there is a tendency to use some sort of vertical axis, some sort of representation, be it a tree or a pole or pillar, as a marker for sacred activity. Eliade suggests that this is a stand-in for the center of the world, the center of the universe, and that people gather around such things in ritual because of a need to be at the center of the cosmos in doing ritual. That if the universe is emanating from one place, that if it circulates around one place, that the closer the people are to that place, then the closer the people are figuratively to creation, if you will. And so therefore, the closer they are to the kind of juice of the sacred world, kind of roots, founding energy of the cosmos, if you will. So hilltops, trees. So we've seen sacred places that penetrate downward, sacred places or things that penetrate upward. And I've just alluded to an underlying concept that links all of those, and that is that whatever the sacred place is, very often what's being made use of is the way in which the place stands in as a local representation of the entire universe, or at least the entire cosmos known by the people. It is a microcosmos, if you will. It stands in for all of creation. And I'm using creation loosely. You don't have to subscribe to a spiritual path that assumes there was an act of creation. Creation can be understood as sort of ongoing. The universe is constantly involved in an ongoing creative act. That's certainly the notion that I subscribe to. So if I use that word, I'm using it in that sense, in the loosest sense, and not in the literal sense of a universe that was started at a specific time by the act of a specific being. In the Irish tradition, the Hill of Uisneach in County Westmeath, which is more or less at the geographic center of the island of Ireland, is interesting because on the hill it has a large stone boulder that, in folklore at least, appears to have been a stone that was regarded as being at the very center of the land, and that it marked where the 5 radiating provinces of Ireland came together and joined, and that rock sort of participated in the characteristics of all of those counties, that it marked the center of the land. It was, to use the Greek term, the omphalos, the navel, the center in the solar plexus center sense of the entire land. So you could, in a sense, think of that Hill of Uisneach and that stone of divisions, as it's been referred to over the years, on the Hill of Uisneach, as standing in for all of the island of Ireland. It is a microcosmic version of the entire larger cosmos of Ireland. Let's say, though, that one was obliged to do ritual work in a place that wasn't seen as possessing a tremendous amount of this brie, this inherent efficacy or energy or influence or power or magnetism or charisma, and that we wanted to make a place sacred, that we wanted to, in a sense, pour this other quality of bua, this other sort of energy, into a place to make it more useful as a ritual place. I just want to suggest a couple of things that one can do to help make a place more sacred. I suppose the first thing I should do is at least address what that word sacred implies. And the notion of sacred is that something is set apart, that it is dedicated to religious usage. Perhaps more properly, one should say it's set aside as being a residence on Earth, or some sort of locus or focal point on Earth of the divine, of the presence of the deities, or perhaps the ancestors, or perhaps spirits of other sorts. But that the sacred place is a separate place. And we're going to talk about boundaries in just a few more minutes here. But that's the first sense. In talking about a sacred place, if we want to look at that word sacred and what it implies, that's the first thing. Another word, and I used it just in passing at the very start, is holy. And that has a different kind of connotation. That speaks more to perhaps that quality of brie, the inherent sense that something has value, that it is worthy of reverence or special regard. So we're kind of talking a little bit about both senses of making a place sacred, perhaps making it or coming to regard it as more holy, being more worthy of regard or reverence or care. And that's the first thing I'm going to look at is taking care of a place, of regarding a place as important enough that it's worthy of special attention and care. So one of the first things we can do to build up our regard for a place so that it seems more, becomes more worthy of use and ritual, is to cleanse and protect the place. And this can apply to an altar in one's home, just as much as it can to, say, a picnic ground in a park that you want to use for ritual, as so often seems to happen in modern paganism. So cleansing something, protecting it, setting up boundaries, even if they're just figurative. Ceremonial magic and modern Wicca have all sorts of approaches to this sort of thing. They're strengths, I think, of those particular spiritual paths. Using things like water or salt or incense passed around a place, or covering it fully as a way of cleansing or driving out contrary energies or entities. Those all have long-standing traditions in both modern and earlier magical practice in the West. It's definitely a practice that's definitely found in Celtic tradition, at least in Gaelic traditions in Ireland and Scotland, to protect a space outdoors, is to pass a flame around it, to pass a torch around, say, a field, to keep out predators and protect the stock. That can't really be seen as a literal form of protection. It's not really going to keep wolves out if you pass a torch around the perimeter of your field where your stock's going to be. So there is something deeper there. There is a notion that fire as a spiritual element, and the heat of the fire and the light of the fire can perhaps drive out and drive away the adverse qualities or beings that might be in and around a place that you want to become sacred, that you want to protect. So using obviously cleansing tools like water, fresh water, but I think most especially in Celtic contexts, fire, and even the smoke of the fire, and so perhaps incense, is an excellent way to protect a space, to pass fire, and you pass it sunwise, clockwise around something, whether around an altar or around, as I say a picnic ground. Psychologically even, for moderns, fire is such an obvious presence. It projects so much energy and light that it's almost impossible not to react to it as an actual dynamic presence in the space. And so that passing fire around something has a kind of immediate, at least aesthetic effect. Even if somebody doesn't really believe that the fire is sacred as such, it's really hard not to be able to visualize a torch going around the perimeter of something as dispelling shadows, cooking, baking away impurities in the same way that boiling something helps sterilize it. I think for modern people, that use of fire in that way is a really direct and immediate action, easily understandable. You can do this with the people in a place, by the way, as much as to the place itself, and many traditions do insist on purifying, cleansing the people before they enter into the sacred space, often using water and incense, sometimes other elements besides. So besides taking care of something, treating it with value, which implies that it's holy, cleansing it, protecting it repeatedly, another thing you can do to it is, in a sense, to feed it, is to offer sacrifice, make offerings in a place. And I think especially to do this repeatedly, to return to a place, to return to a shrine or an altar in your home repeatedly, and to use it, to make use of it, to treat it well, to give it offerings, to dress it up. I think putting flowers around the site, or even just returning grain or other foodstuffs to the land, things that are biodegradable, that will go back into and provide nutrients back into the earth. This is, again, as with the fire, returning nutrients, returning foodstuffs, returning grain to the land, returning water to the land, feeding it, if you will, is a very immediate, very comprehensible way of empowering the place. And by going back and doing this repeatedly, you start to build up, at least in your own psyche, the place's importance. If you treat something as if it has value, ultimately it will take on that characteristic. It will have value. And as we see in, for example, burial sites, chambered tombs and burial mounds, things of that nature, in Celtic and pre-Celtic sites in the British Isles, places will be used for generations for a specific sacred purpose. For example, the interment of the dead. And the more you do that, the more you go back and use the place for sacred purpose over and over, the more power it takes on with time. I want to move into a little bit more about architecture, about the physical things that might go into a sacred place. And I said I would talk a little bit about places, structures that the ancient Celts, Druids, might have used for ritual purpose, apart from the natural environment, apart from these supposed groves and the dark forests that they worshipped in. For a long time, it was sort of assumed that temple structures were more of a Mediterranean thing, that they were more a Roman and a Greek thing, and that maybe it was true that the Celts did worship in these outdoor places. But there have been archaeological finds that are pre-Roman in the British Isles that suggest that there were temple constructions in what were Celtic lands rather than Roman lands or Roman-influenced lands. The most famous of these was found during excavations for a construction of a runway at Heathrow Airport outside London. That was a rectangular structure. Archaeologists are quite convinced that it was, in fact, a ritual structure, that it was some sort of temple, not a dwelling place or a storehouse. And there have been a couple other finds since then, at least a couple others. In addition, one of the most famous, clearly ritual sites in Ireland, in the north, Ewan Macha, which is the traditional capital of ancient Ulster, the northern province of Ireland, clearly has ritual purpose. It's a circular mound structure. It has evidence of ritual burning and other ritual use, but it's not a natural feature, and it also involves construction on top of a mound. So again, an example of clearly non-Roman, pre-Roman ritual construction, a sacred site that was not just simply a natural feature, but involved human construction, in this case from Ireland. And on the continent, in areas that were Celtic or closely associated with Celtic-speaking peoples, we find examples of, again, rectangular structures that are clearly ritual in nature. There's a German word that associates with these, Viereckschanzen. It's Viereckschanzen, and that implies four-cornered, i.e. rectangular. In Indo-European tradition, generally, the priest in such a place would face east, which one assumes has to do with where the sun comes from, where the beginning of the coming of the light is in the east. So it's reasonable to assume that the Celts, like other Indo-Europeans, probably favored that sort of an arrangement for any temples that they might have made, and altars within them. I'm going to come back to altars in just a second, but just to talk briefly about temples. If you're building a temple, you are doing another version of what I touched on a minute ago, the creation of a microcosmos, of some sort of structure that, in some sense, replicates or reflects or ties into the structure of the cosmos or important features of the cosmos. In Christian tradition, the cathedral, first of all, has a cruciform shaped like the cross, so it participates in that central mystery of that religion, crucifixion and then resurrection of Jesus. But it also is a crossroads, which is a very important cross-cultural marker for sacred and magical action. Things like, selling your soul happen at the crossroads. There's, of course, the goddess Hecate among the Hellenic peoples who is at the crossroads. The Etruscans placed great importance on the crossroads for sacred work. There's all sorts of cultures, Indo-European and otherwise, who see crossroads as being important transitional places. Again, that's that boundary quality, liminality that I'm going to come back to in just a couple minutes now. So the Christian Catholic cathedral, with its cross-shaped architecture, creates not just a replica of their cross on which their Savior hung, but also replicates the crossroads, which is an important magical ritual place. And it places the altar, it places the focus of Christian ritual in these structures right there at the crossroads, where everything concentrates. So that's one example of architecture, sacred architecture, that on more than one level embodies important spiritual concepts, that replicates features in the natural world or in the human world that enhance the sort of sacred character. And so attention has been paid in the architecture to sort of increase that sense. But in general, in building a temple, you want to try to create a place of offering, place for offerings, that's at a place of power. In the words of the British comic Eddie Izzard, you build Stonehenge in a place like Salisbury Plain, which has a reputation of being sort of ooh, not a place that's as he says there. You build Trump Tower. So as often as not, you want to site your temple in a place that already has some sort of importance, and then within that you want to create some sort of center, some sort of central place, some sort of focus within this sacred precinct that you've created at the place of power, where the work that's sacred, where the work of ritual, the work of worship, of making sacrificial offering and what have you, can be focused. So in a certain sense, there's almost concentric rings going on there. You've found a suitable place. Within that, you've then created some sort of sacred architecture, whether it's just a simple earthwork surrounding the place, or whether it's a Gothic cathedral, what have you. But then within that, you find sort of the heart of the architecture. You create the altar. You create some sort of central locus. Now, it doesn't have to be an altar like you'd find in a Catholic cathedral. It can be a well or a shaft. It could be a tree on which you tie cloths accompanied by your prayers. It can be a fire altar, as we probably found in most of the ancient Indo-European paganisms, and still find, for example, in Zoroastrianism, which is a descendant of ancient Persian paganism. The sacred fire there is sort of the heart of their churches, their temples. So whatever this altar is, I'm going to use that term to refer to all of these different possible places of offering. Whatever it is, it's important, I think, that there be one, that there be some kind of focus. It's possible to do ritual work without that, but it's pretty unusual. Altars can be used in different ways. They can be used as a staging area for sacred tools. There might not be actually any offerings per se made to or at or on the altar. Or they can be the place that receives the offerings. The ancient Greeks were fond of pouring all sorts of libations onto their altars. Sometimes wine, often the blood of a sacrificed animal. But you can think of the altar as the center of the universe. If the sacred precinct replicates the universe, and it sort of sits for the time of the ritual at the center of the universe, then the altar and the work that's done there is happening in the very heart of the very center of the universe for the ritual time. How do you mark out the Nemeton, the sacred place, the sanctuary, particularly if you don't have architecture, if you're convening a Neo-Pagan ritual, a modern Druid ritual, say in a park? It seems important that there be boundaries, that if the place is going to be sacred, if, as I say, the word sacred implies that it's a thing set apart for religious purpose, for divine use, what have you, then the only way it can be set apart is if there's some sort of boundary. And this is where we get into that concept of liminality, of the lining between one area and another, the creating of boundaries, quality or characteristic of having boundaries. Boundaries can be hard and impenetrable. They can be permeable. And sometimes it's helpful to think about which sort of boundary one wants. It's very commonplace in Wiccan practice to create a circle, a magical circle, as the perimeter of the ritual space, and to treat that as inviolable, to say to participants that if you need to leave or if you want to enter after the ritual's begun, you have to be cut in or cut out with the use of a ritual blade. That there is an attempt to maintain an intact boundary, impenetrable boundary for the course of the ritual. Other traditions allow a more permeable approach. They might acknowledge that there is a ritual space that could be defined by either temporary or literal features, but that people can enter, that they can come and go during the course of the ritual, that the place is still sacred, but it doesn't have to be completely inviolable, that it can allow for comings and goings of various sorts. So decisions have to be made about that in creating even temporary ad hoc ritual space. How permeable do you want your boundaries to be? And how literal? Do you want to actually stake out with stakes or poles and rope or ribbon, some sort of perimeter around your ritual space? There are approaches like that in some Norse traditions, some modern Norse traditions, where the corners of the ritual space are staked out and some sort of chain or rope or perimeter is erected. I think most Neo-Pagans are used to the more figurative boundary, the casting of a circle or something of that nature, but there are other approaches. So just to sort of finish that thought about the more figurative boundary, magical boundaries are pretty common in modern pagan usage. The casting of a circle in Wicca, and there are lots of different approaches to it. Some traditions carve out the boundary using a blade, such as a sword or a spear or even just a knife, an athame. Others might use aspersing with water and the casting of salt or the sweeping around the space with a broom. There are any number of different ways to define the space. I'm inclined to liking the Celtic sort of folkloric practice that I've already alluded to, passing the torch around the perimeter as a way of marking out where the ritual is happening. Even if I don't then treat that boundary as impenetrable, at least you said, look, within this boundary is where the sacred action is going to happen. You might be able to come and go, but here within this perimeter is where the sacred actions are going to take place. Another way to look at it is from the outside. If you want negative things to stay on the outside, perhaps you say, okay, we've got our altar here in the middle, or perhaps we have a flame at or on our altar. And we'll say that our ritual space extends as far away as this flame or this altar or what have you is visible. Or perhaps you could be drumming, and the understanding then is, enforced by prayer or offering or invocation, or just simply decree, that within the sound of the drums, the space is sacred. So there you're sort of decreeing to those on the outside, stay away from what you can see or what you can hear. And I think one last way to look at this is for the people participating, the folk of the ritual as being the boundary. One of the things that seems to be almost universal, not 100% universal, but pretty close in modern paganism, is ritual in circle. There's a tendency in modern paganism to want to overthrow the rigid hierarchical traditions of the mainstream monotheisms, and in particular the notion that a priest holds some sort of privileged place, that only they have access to parts of the cathedral, say, the religious structure, because they're special in a certain way, they're consecrated in a certain way. Modern paganism has tended to want to downplay or completely overthrow those precedents. And so having people standing as equals in a circle is a very powerful embodiment of that tendency, of that wish. But it's not without at least kind of vague links to traditional Celtic culture. So much of the ancient cultures, and even more modern cultures in the Celtic lands, were organized around local groupings, around kin groups, or even more extended groups like the tribe, the provincial nation, if you will, or Tua, T-U-A-T-H, where people would come together several times a year to trade, and at least once a year for a major assembly. And so the boundaries, if you will, of the assembly were equal to the people of the Tua, of the group. And you can sort of look at, figuratively, modern pagan ritual as at the very least being defined by the presence of the people, particularly in circle. They become, in essence, the boundary for the sacred space by their presence and by the way in which they've gathered in circle. The last concept I want to touch on harkens back to the earlier comments on making a place sacred. And that's on things that you can do to charge the Nemeton, to charge the sacred place. And this is particularly useful, I think, for personal altars and shrines in the home. Just some techniques that can be used. First is to visualize and to vocalize, I suppose, along with that. But certainly you can start by visualizing. To see in your mind's eye, in your vision eye, if you will, your inner eye, the place as charged with energy, as radiant, or any other sort of visualization that feels as though it resonates with you as putting this place into a special light. In essence, what you want to do is to, and I like the word ensoul, to give soul to the place or the shrine or the altar. And mostly what you want to do is, again, as I alluded to earlier, act as though the thing were so. Visualize, speak about the shrine or the sacred precinct as though it were such, as though it were sacred. And this reflects back to something I talked about in the previous lecture in the series, of meaning what you say. And if you say something repeatedly, and you say it with intent, and you say it fully, it will move you. It will move your psyche in that direction. You will start to treat the thing as such. Not an earth-shaking truth. I think most people do that intuitively. You come to a thing repeatedly and you treat it with high regard, and naturally you begin to really believe fully that is the case. You can help yourself by adding icons or images. And they don't necessarily have to be literal icons of a god or a goddess or spirit or ancestor. They can be animals that you associate with a god or a goddess, for example. They can be clip art, they can be collage, they can be what have you. But the ancients, particularly the peoples of the Mediterranean, were really big on the use of icons and images, statuary. The Celts may not have been so much. We generally tend to think that the Celts didn't carve images of the gods and goddesses until they were influenced by the Romans. But there are examples here and there of kind of non-human looking faces that are assumed to be images of deities, of Celtic deities. And the fact that they are less than literal representation of human faces or bodies is evocative in itself. It shows them as being something other than just merely human. They have human characteristics, but yet they're not fully human, or they're other than human. So there are all sorts of different ways in which you can load, whether it's a personal shrine or a shared space, with imagery that's meaningful. And it's great to add to this over time, as many modern pagans have found. Most altars I've seen are often dense with objects and images and various icons. And of course, the last thing is to seek the aid of those powers that one finds to be their allies through prayer and through invocation, through making offering, whether it's lighting incense or putting out a cup of ale or whiskey or something, accompanied with the request, again, meaning what you say, that those allies come to the place and they come into the place, and that they make themselves and feel free to make themselves as welcome at the shrine, in the sacred precinct, as you, the human worshiper, wants to be welcome there. So those are just some approaches to both ancient and modern pagan as well as ancient druidic, to approaching, defining, and working with sacred space.
For the guided visualization that follows, you should have a lit candle before you. You may wish to pause the recording at this time in order to set up and light a candle for that purpose.
Take in the light of the fire, study it, and then close your eyes, holding the image of the candle's flame within. Let the light fill your inner vision eye and resolve itself into the sun, blazing in the sky. Blue sky over a green landscape. As your vision comes down from the sun and takes in the landscape, you find yourself by a well. Old stones, fresh water. Find yourself by the well and look about for objects that might be worth offering to the depths of the well, down deep into the subterranean depths where the ancestors are buried. The goddess of the land dwells. And if there is such an object or objects, take this time to offer it deep to the depths of the well. Not surprisingly, by the well, there's at least one tree. One tree that catches your attention. Be with that tree. Study how it reaches up to the sky, reaches down with its roots into the ground, pulling up the water, same water that feeds the well. Perhaps you may wish to say a word to the tree. Perhaps you wish to tie something on its branches. There, exposed to the wind, to the sky, to the light of the sun, the light of the moon. As you move away from the tree, find the slope of the ground increasing. And as you move along, you find yourself moving up a hill. Higher, higher you climb, past stones, perhaps bushes or trees, ascending to the top of the hill. Look for and find a rolling mound, an earthwork, ancient, encircling the highest point at the top of the hill. Enter the circle formed by the earthwork. Stand at the top of the hill between earth and sky. This is place for a fire. Perhaps there's material there to build a fire. Perhaps there's the remnants of an ancient altar. Perhaps you've stumbled onto a place where the fire is already blazing. But this is the time to stand between heaven and earth with a fire and watch the fire reaching up to the heavens, up to rejoin its kindred, the sun, the moon, the stars, as you would reach up to touch those fiery objects and receive their energy yourself. And if there is anything, any object or objects there on the hilltop that you can offer into the fire, that you would see carried up to the heavens, now is the time to do that. And when you've done whatever it is you need to do at the fire, sit beside the fire on the hilltop, taking in its glow, its energy, its heat, just as you take in the energy from the skies above, and even the subtler nurturing energies of the land, the earth below you. And when you've done what you need to have done with the fire on the hilltop, watch that fire recede from you, recede as you drift away back to where you began this journey, back to the flame from which you first set out on this journey, back to the glow of the candle. And when you've finished what you need to do, back into the room from which you departed.